India is an adventurous paradise. You head out for a holiday, which quickly turns into a survival situation. A dream turns into a nightmare.
I'm thirsty, I'm tired, I'm hungry, and I'm lost.
Shelter, water, and food become a priority. A fire to keep you warm. But how? I'm Chandan Lahiri from OTA Survival School. I'll give you some tips and show you some tricks to use in a self-reliant situation. Do not think problems can only happen to other people. It can happen to you. When you're walking through terrain like this, you need to know how much you have walked, what distance you have covered, to be able to navigate. You should know that you have covered 2 kilometers, 5 kilometers, 10 kilometers from the place you started, from the base camp. So you know the distance you have traveled. Not so much for your interest's sake, but more as knowledge if you get into a survival situation. So you can actually tell somebody, signal, use the phone, and tell them that I'm 2.5 kilometers away from that location. How do you know it's 2.5 kilometers or whatever the distance? One is to use a GPS, but if you're not using a GPS or the batteries have run out, there's a very simple way they can actually figure out pretty accurately as to how much you've covered. And that's by counting steps. Let me show you how. Remember, when you're walking downhill, the length of your footsteps is different from when you're walking uphill. So when you're walking downhill, as I just did, from there to here, count the number of steps you took to cover a distance. Let's say 100 yards. 100 yards took me 20 steps, 30 steps, 35 steps, 40 steps, 10 steps, whatever the number of steps. Count that. That's when you're coming downhill. Let's assume that it's 30 steps to cover 100 yards. Now cover the same 100 yards when you're going uphill. Now when you're going uphill and when it becomes a little steeper, what you'll find is that the length of your steps becomes shorter. So if you took 30 steps to cover 100 yards going downhill, you might require 50 steps to cover that same 100 yards when you're going uphill. It's the same 100 yards, but when you're lost and you need to signal, or for information's sake, or for drawing up a trail map, if you know the distance that you have covered by counting the number of steps, you'll know the distance that you have covered. And unless you know how many steps you need to cover a given distance, you'll never know the distance that you've actually covered. So take that distance and try it across different kinds of terrain. 100 yards uphill, 100 yards downhill, 100 yards on a desert, 100 yards on a dune, 100 yards on a flat plain, in a meadow, in snow, in ice, on tarmac, on dirt roads. Each of them will give you a different figure. You're still the same person, you're still walking the same way that you always do, but the length of your step will change depending on the terrain. So when you're walking, always count your steps, and I suggest you do that across different terrain like I mentioned, so that you know how many steps you require to cover any given distance. And when you're on the trail, you know what distance you've covered. And by counting your steps, you know the distance you've covered, and it makes it much easier for you to draw a trail map. So if you're camped out here and there's a water source somewhere down which you have found, and you're keeping a trail map and you know how many steps you require, you can draw the trail map. You might think it couldn't happen to you, but if you're lost, if you're injured, if you have to signal for help, and if you have to send your coordinates, if you have the information by counting your steps, the other person can find you much more easily. Remember, it can happen to you. Learn to adapt, improvise, innovate, and overcome. To learn more tips and tricks, visit this site. I'm Chandan Lahiri, and I hope to see you soon at the OTA Survival School. Leave nothing but footprints. Bring back nothing but memories.